Simon is the CEO of ODDA, which stands for Online Dating and Discovery Association. And Simon Newman has been running it since mid-2024 now. And his background is in cybercrime prevention and crime prevention with various police forces around the UK and the world, including Abu Dhabi for several years. Yeah, we talked a bit about that. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you once again for the invitation. Very kind of you to invite me along. Big fan of this. I think it's been a really, as someone who's new to the industry. In fact, as you said, I think 2 weeks' time will be my first anniversary at the ODDA. So really coming up to a first year. So as Mark said, my name's Simon. I run the ODDA. And I'll just talk a little bit about what we're about, but in particular, I wanted to focus on some of the things that we are campaigning about at the moment, which I know from speaking to some of the people in the little rooms beforehand are issues that you're all faced as well. So hopefully, Mark, that's also changed to the next slide. Just very briefly about the ODDA, we were founded 11 years ago, originally the Online Dating Association. Effectively, a group of well-known dating apps got together to try and improve the reputation of the sector, and that's effectively what its primary purpose has been since then. Beginning of last year, so just before I joined, we expanded to include that extra D, which includes social discovery organizations as well. So that's effectively the ODDA in terms of what it is. Our membership is generally what I class as mainstream apps, and we operate all over the world, focusing perhaps primarily on English-speaking countries, so the US, UK, Australia, but also a big presence in Europe, which I'll come on to in a moment as well. We have quite a few of the big names, the well-known ones that are out there, and increasingly many of the smaller organizations. As I joined, I've been really keen to support startups out there, particularly in relation to the trust and safety space. And that's really very much about our role. I often talk about it being a shield and a sword, so protecting reputations and kind of taking the fight back to government and others to make sure that legislation is as fair as it can be to our sector. And we also work with some associates as well who have traditionally perhaps operated in the trust and safety space, who support some of our members in other ways, like things like age verification. I won't dwell on too much on this, but these are the things effectively that we cover as a trade association. Those 7 things there are what I've been prioritising since I joined in June of last year. And again, I'll talk about some of the policy and advocacy work that we're currently involved in very shortly. Standards clearly is a really important part of what we do. This is about raising the standards across the sector, trying to address some of perhaps the misconceptions that the media in particular has on our sector, and working with other organisations and regulators to make sure that we can kind of set ourselves apart from other sectors that are out there. We also do lots of events, particularly on recognising our kind of global footprint. We usually do a couple of webinars each month, usually with a policy or regulatory focus. So we invite speakers from government and elsewhere to talk about legislation and policy and what it means for our sector. And again, as a member, you get access to all of those outside of membership as well. And that's something I've always been very keen to push and promote to benefit everyone and not just those that are part of the ODDA. We're starting to do more in terms of industry insight. I'll talk a bit more later on about a particular interesting piece of work that we're doing about effectively addressing, again, those misconceptions, but focusing on the societal benefits of online dating. So this is about how dating, which is incredibly mainstream, is effectively a way of showing how it's addressing marriages, tackling things like the loneliness epidemic. So those types of things, it's the benefit that dating has on society. So we're working with some universities to focus on that. Talk about campaigns, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. We're in the process as well of building an academy. And this is about offering accredited online course to people in the sector, particularly around trust and safety. So it's a way of demonstrating to regulators, to customers and to others that staff are invested in, and it's a way of also sort of satisfying some of the compliance requirements that are coming out of regulators and government internationally. And then that last part on crisis management, again, this is about responding to various media reports. There's some stuff going on in Australia at the moment where we're supporting the Match Group in addressing some concerns that have been aired on a documentary on Channel 7. We've also just recently recruited an independent board member who's a crisis management specialist, and he's going to be working with us to make sure that we can kind of be much more proactive and a lot louder in in defending the industry and demonstrating what it's doing to address some of these concerns that sadly we're all familiar with. So that's a little bit about what we do. I won't focus too much on membership, but obviously we're delighted to expand the ODDA and very keen to have conversations with people about joining us. I will just flag that we are having our very first annual conference in October in central London. It's got a regulation and a policy focus, and obviously members, it's free to attend in person, including a lunch that we're going to be hosting with a member of the UK Parliament who's been quite influential in the online safety space. So I'm really keen to obviously drive up membership for us as well. This is the bit I wanted to talk to you about, some of the things that we're working on, and these really are cross-border. So some of these things you will recognise, and I'm sure will be issues that are affecting your apps and platforms as well. The first one, sadly, is something we know too much about, which is around romance fraud. We know the statistics out there to show that it's still one of the biggest crime types that's out there, and it's creating obviously a lot of challenges for apps in terms of fake profiles, and obviously abuses that happen on the platforms and beyond the platforms. One of the things that we're doing at the moment is working very closely with law enforcement, both in the UK and internationally, including the FBI and district attorneys, to look at how we can actually tackle that. So we are trying to look at prevention, as well as trying to root out those bad actors that do manage to get through those verification processes. And I'll just talk in a minute about the pilot that we've been running, which will be rolling out free of charge for all our members at some point during the autumn. There are some big challenges that we've. I was at the United Nations on Monday in Vienna talking about some of the work that our members are doing in this area, but information sharing amongst platforms and beyond the sector is clearly one of our biggest issues. But one of the good news, and I did want to sort of stress this, we've just got some data through from law enforcement that shows that romance fraud is now far more prevalent on social media sites than it is on online dating. So when everyone thinks about romance fraud, they often think about online dating as the place where it takes place, but we now have the data to say that's not the case. And a lot of that is because of the measures that people like yourselves have put in, ID verification and other checks, that makes it much harder those criminals to target other users. So, you know, again, some good news, but still a lot more work to be done. And I just very briefly wanted to talk about this pilot that we've been running recently here through the ODDA. So we've been working with a number of members, my very low quality graphic washing machine there. And what we wanted to try and do was test a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is how much or how many kind of bad actors, fraudsters are targeting our sites. Where do they come from? And how long does it take them to move between one site and another? So we started the pilot off with 4 of our members, and you can see they range from a couple of large ones, a small one, and a medium side. And you can see the volume there in just a 30-day window was pretty significant. And there's a couple of things that were really interesting about that. So the first thing is that we were finding that some of the smaller services actually had data that the bigger ones didn't. So that some of these fraudsters were targeting smaller services as opposed to the big ones first. We're also tracking the average time it takes for them to move from one site to another, which again has been really valuable. And what we're doing is effectively we're taking IP addresses, we're risk assessing those IP addresses, and we use a third-party organization called Scamalytics to do that for us. We mix that with a load of other data coming from financial services and other sector, and we can give a very, very high degree of confidence that that IP address is a bad actor. And we then give that information in real time to those apps who then can decide what they want to do. Now, all that's needed is just an API link. It's as simple as that. But again, it's been really interesting to see some of the data that we've gotten so far. And we've been sharing that more broadly. And that's also been working with law enforcement as well. Over time, potentially with this, we can add on email addresses, images, and other data as well to make it incredibly powerful. Our goal in this is to make the dating sector as hostile as possible to bad actors. That's really the key. We're never going to stamp it out completely, but we just want to make our sector less attractive than others. And that's really our goal. So we're quite excited by some of the early results that we've had. The second thing I wanted to talk about in terms of focus is around legislation. Many of you are aware of some really big pieces of legislation that have been passed in the past couple of years across the UK and Europe. The US is interesting, and I'll come on to that in a second. But for example, in the UK, we've got the Online Safety Act. So if you have any users based in the UK, you'll need to comply with your new legal obligations under the Act. Ofcom, who's the regulator here in the UK, ran a conference today on harm to children, preventing children from accessing platforms that are designed for over 18s. We've also got a lot of work around digital markets, and particularly in relation to subscriptions. So a whole new regime is being proposed for the UK, which mirrors what's happening across Europe. And again, we're working with people like Spotify, Netflix and other organizations to again just challenge government to make sure that they're not imposing rules and policies and guidance that restricts what we're trying to do across our sector. If you have users in Australia, you may be familiar with the e-safety commissioner, who's taken quite a bold position on lots of online safety policy areas. One, and perhaps the most well-known one, is that under 16s being banned from social media completely. But also there was the introduction in October last year of the online dating safety code. So we're waiting to see the first kind of report coming out from that. But that's really a e-safety commissioner getting together with some of the major platforms to try and tackle some of the problems that they've seen over there. So there's also talk potentially about looking at that from the UK perspective. And we know that the US is also following things quite closely as well. European Union, which is a really big and interesting market in many ways. We had the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act a couple of years ago. The implementation of those is now sort of midway through. The Digital Fairness Act coming up potentially in 2026, and new rules around age verification as well. So this year has been huge in terms of legislation, and I think that just kind of gives an indication of the directions of governments around the world. And of course, regulators all speak to one another. There's an international forum where they get together and try and ensure consistency in approach. So that's really a big part of our focus. And I just wanted to touch on the US, and there's two particular things there which I think are really interesting. The first is a federal bill, which currently I think within Congress, called the Romance Scam Prevention Bill. And that's a piece of legislation which places a responsibility on dating apps to notify its users, including those who have subsequently left the app, that they have a user that has or a ban in some way. So again, that's designed to try and reduce online fraud on a number of different apps. So that's going to be interesting to see whether that passes. There was a previous attempt that fell just before the presidential election in November. So we expect that this will go through because it's got both parties supporting it. And then we're starting to see more now in the way of age assurance legislation being brought in at state level. So Texas, I think, was the last one a few weeks ago. And I think it's something around about 21 states now has some form of legislation around it. No federal bill at the moment, but again, we expect that to be happening in the next year or two as well. So loads and loads of stuff going on from a legislation perspective. And of course, we're working with decision makers and regulators and others to try and just make sure that they understand the unique needs of our sector, particularly smaller organizations. And the impact on smaller apps is huge. And you look at that and the requirements. If you're operating on your own or with a small team, you're going to spend all your time trying to comply with the legislation. So we're trying to make a strong cases where we can to fight back on some of that and really take or move away from what we describe as a one-size-fits-all approach. The one aspect of legislation I did just want to talk about, which I mentioned there, what's going on in the US, is around age verification. So the UK has introduced with the Online Safety Act something they call highly effective age assurance. That means if you have customers in the UK, you now have to demonstrate that you have no children or that children are not able to access your service. And the only way you can do that is by those things that are listed there on those bullet points. So a credit card check, if they use open banking, photo ID matching, facial age estimation, you've got mobile network operator age checks, digital identity services, or email-based age estimation. So those are the things that the regulator will accept as highly effective age assurance. And one of the challenges we've had, some of our members will operate services for people who are over 50 or over 60 and say that, look, these are things that are just not attractive to an under 18-year-old. Now, historically, that would have been fine. The regulators are now saying, no, that's not good enough. The fact is that a child potentially could still access that content, and therefore you've got to have HEAA in place. And those 4 boxes there are effectively what the regulator deems as appropriate. So technical accuracy, robustness, reliability, and fairness. And on that reliability point, we've been talking to the Age Verification Providers Association, who've got a big presence in the US. They're setting the benchmark at 95% reliability. So that kind of gives you an indication of some of the things that we're doing in the UK. We're probably and perhaps some other jurisdictions around the world. In the UK, dating apps have now got until the 24th of July to carry out what they call a children's risk assessment. And from the 25th of July this year, they will then have to start implementing highly effective age assurance. And if I'm passing comment on this, I would say that our sector is really not that well prepared for it. There are worse sectors, but we need to do more. So we're trying to raise awareness and promote the importance of getting ahead of this, because the enforcement, unfortunately, is looking quite heavy. If you don't comply with the legislation, then the fines are £18 million. What's that, about $25 million, or 10% of global turnover, whichever is higher. So pretty significant fines. So just something I wanted to flag up there that we're focusing on. Another big campaign as well that we're working very hard with at the moment is around the dominance of big tech, and in particular the app stores. So the dominance of Apple and Google. May be familiar with this in terms of the risks that you have to cooperate with, which in our view, damages growth, innovation, and reduces competition. We have taken this to governments, both here in the UK and internationally, particularly with the European Commissioner. What we're looking at trying to establish is what we call a level playing field. So this means that native apps aren't prioritised over other app developers. We've also been working with a coalition for app fairness and the Competition and Markets Authority here in the UK, who are a regulator, in supporting investigations that are ongoing. And again, if you've picked up some of this, there's 2 investigations in the UK and a further 2 investigations in the European Union as well that look at the dominance of Apple and Google. So this is a really key thing for us that we're going to be focusing on, certainly for the next 12 months, as we try and create that level playing field that hopefully does away with some of those issues. And then the final thing I just wanted to say as another sort of campaign area, and again, this is something that many of you will recognize, is around the payment systems providers industry. Organizations like Stripe recently decided that dating firms were effectively categorized as high risk and therefore would no longer be accepted as customers. Banks and other financial institutions have as a high risk sector, very much in the same way that they do with pornographic services. So what we're doing is working with organizations like WorldPay and other providers, like Newman, for example, looking at how we can de-risk the sector. What can we do? What reassurance can we give that will hopefully encourage these organizations to look more favorably on our sector? The consequence of this, if you can't get a payment provider, you're either going to end up paying higher costs because the risk is greater, or alternatively, what's going to happen is you may well choose a provider or be forced to choose a provider in a less well-regulated country. And that's, of course, opens up to further risk as well. If we add on to that, Visa have introduced some changes to something called the VAMP, the Visa Acquiring Monitoring Program. And again, there are some big impacts on the online dating sector. And we ran a webinar, was it last week, I think, on the VAMP program and what that means, which we're publishing online and will be available to members for free. But I can show you also where you can get a copy of that. And it's just an hour. Those changes are. We've got 2 experts who've been very helpful in providing that overview. So those are some of the big issues that we're working on at the moment. As I've said, previously, this is about being a kind of a sword and a shield. Our job is to try and make sure that we can represent the interest as best we can, give it a really loud voice for those regulating policymakers, and try and make sure we can get some favourable legislation that helps us. There's my details to have a chat. We'll always be delighted to welcome people as new members. Our membership starts at £550 UK, which is about $700, I think, depending on the exchange rate. But obviously happy to discuss that through. Do give us a follow. The QR code there takes you just through to our membership page if you're interested in joining. But that's it. So thank you, Mark, for giving me the opportunity to speak to everyone. I don't even have any questions at all.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I must say, I feel like ODDA is in very good hands. That was very good to see. And thank you also for laying out how to join as well. I think I'd encourage our audience to seriously consider joining and supporting. The way to consider like IDEA, ODDA is a little bit confusing. ODDA is insurance. ODDA is all about making sure that you're ahead of legislation, you're clear on what the payment processing changes are in shape. I'd heard about Stripe. I actually had a client say, yeah, Stripe should be okay. It was like, actually, it turns out it's not. So,
yeah.
You know what I like about Stripe? Link.
Yes.
Link is on Stripe. It's really compelling as an alternative to the Apple platform, but it's on Stripe. So actually, I don't know if you know, is there an alternative to Link that isn't running on Stripe? Because that would be very useful for Apple and, moving away from, about the Apple judgment in the USA, where you can actually have your own payment provider. They've removed the restrictions. They've made it not difficult. There's no financial there's no longer that 20+%, fine. Essentially, it's a fine for using an off-platform. Right. So, but Link is the only thing I've seen that looks really super compelling, and that's on Stripe. So.
Yeah, there's a few alternatives out there. I mean, we've been working with Shift4 recently, which have got quite a good history in the industry and seem to be too well. But again, that's something I think we want to look at in terms of signposting people towards that we know will support the sector and that address some of those issues. And again, just on that point, Mark, as we said, you're absolutely right. The ODDA is that insurance, that sword and shield. And I think where the two organisations, your organisation and ours, complement one another, is you're there to help growth. And that's the bit that we don't do and we can't do. And it's great to be able to sort of work with you in partnership and hopefully signpost people towards you as well, to take them on that journey to become the big players of tomorrow and see them flourish.
Thank you. Marriage made in heaven. Right, Q&A. We do have a question from Benji. Thank you, Benji. Benji says, you mentioned Apple and Google for dominance of big tech. What about social media, Facebook, enter the dating space, as an example?
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And we've often looked at that and see how they would kind of have an impact on the industry. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another point we've been raising as well. And we've recently written to all members of Parliament in the UK, and we'll do a similar exercise in Europe and the US, raising that point and others as well, in just terms of the dominance that these organisations have. I mean, dare I say it, a lot of fraud is also committed on the likes of the Facebooks of this world. That's where a lot of it sits in terms of romance fraud. And we engage with them from time to time with Meta, but they are quite a closed shop. So I think the route for us is keep banging the drum, making the noise through the regulators, both at a national and international level, and hopefully we can get that message through. My general experience is that the feedback is normally very positive. I do hear from governments, they really want to encourage smaller app developers, and they do see that these tech giants are kind of hindering growth, but we've got to keep making that noise.
Simon Newman, you are the CEO of ODDA. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone.